A little disclaimer in the beginning, as this chapter becomes somewhat explicit at some point. I had to cut some of it out for the YouTube version. However, this will be on AO3 and on Spotify. I still hope you enjoyed the chapter. Azoth by Zeitgeistic. Chapter 11. Multiplication. Multiplication, the act or process of multiplying or increasing a number, the state of being multiplied.
Lead only has 3 more protons than gold does,
Draco said the next week. They were out by the forest, talking idly of their project while Harry gathered paralytic mosses for Snape's assignment from the grey-pink stones that stuck up from the grass near the trees. Sometimes he wasn't entirely convinced that Snape wasn't using his apprenticeship as a way of accidentally killing Harry off.
"Yep,"
said Harry. "You know, we read the book after all.
Knock those 3 bits off and it's no longer lead."
Draco scrunched his nose as Harry scraped off a bit of moss, not quite as carefully as he could have.
I just find it really hard to believe that muggles have achieved one of the main tenets of alchemy. Well, not really, said Harry. I mean, they did transmute a really tiny bit of gold a few times, but it was radioactive, and I think it decayed back into mercury or something anyway. I still don't understand what radioactive decay means, said Draco, nor how an inorganic substance can decay. Bacteria doesn't eat metal. It's a different sort of decaying, Harry said. There's different types of radioactive decay, but you could think of that kind like this. Suppose you had a pureblood family, an element. It's a pretty stable family. Christmas dinners with relatively no fighting, everyone's got little heirs and no one's causing a scandal. But then, one of the heirs, a proton, goes off and marries a muggle-born, and the heir is disinherited. The pureblood family tries to be a new element, an element that never needed that heir, but it did have their heir once, and it knows that something is missing. No matter how hard it tries, it can't be normal without that heir, because it's unstable, and it just keeps getting worse. First, one of the other heirs hates the family and decides, since the other heir left, it can too. The family's only got 3 heirs left, so one tries restabilizing the family and it marries into another good pureblood family, and for a little while the family is sort of stable again, held together by the new family. But it can't last, and then another one of their heirs gets addicted to dark magic and goes mad. And then the other one resents what's happened to its family and does something crazy to fix it, but it ends up getting killed. There's nothing left but the heir who married out, but now the family is so unstable that the last heir has to renounce it altogether and become only this new element it married into, or else it'll go mad from the instability too. Draco considered this. My mother's family is radioactive, he decided. Harry nodded. Yeah, and radioactive things destroy everything else around them, so that's why muggles haven't really achieved alchemy. They can't keep the gold stable once they've turned it. It's not real, natural gold. It's just sort of gold. To make normal gold, you've got to take away 3 heirs without tearing the family apart. They have to be good marriages, and then you've got to sort out the neutrons, the, house elves. Why anyone would get married with all this radioactivity is beyond me, Draco muttered. Imagine having to decide who gets to keep the cooking elf and which of the scullery elves has to be killed altogether. Harry rolled his eyes. Imagine. They'd reached the castle by now, and the door opened just as they came up on their stairs. The headmistress stepped out, peering all around the grounds before she noticed them ascending. There you are, Mr. Malfoy, she said. I finished analyzing your mineral transfigurations, and I have some comments for you. Shall we discuss it now? I've an engagement this evening. Of course, headmistress, Draco said, and he was already up the stairs and disappearing into the castle from McGonagall's office before Harry even blinked. Potter? McGonagall greeted. No regret? Harry beamed. None, Professor. She smiled softly. I'm glad to hear it, Potter. She hesitated and seemed to come to a decision. My apprentice may have hinted that you helped him complete the animagus transformation. Very difficult for someone who hasn't done it himself to teach another. but I am certain that no student of mine would become an unregistered animagus. Absolutely not.
Harry agreed, doing his best to feign shock, outrage, and being scandalized. McGonagall made a little sound that in anyone else might be constituted to be a huff of laughter.
However, if one of my students were to hypothetically do such a thing, what sort of form do you imagine he might take? Out of curiosity.
Harry did laugh, ducking his head to hide the extent of his fondness for McGonagall and her inability to be subtle, even when she was breaking the rules. There was no question about whether or not to trust her. Headmistress or not, they were of a kind, and Gryffindors were loyal to their own.
One might be a crow headmistress.
She considered this.
That would be an excellent form for a student so captivated with flying.
She decided.
Well, if the student should ever like to become an animagus and register, then I should be delighted to assist in any way as he begins the process. Thanks, Professor.
McGonagall smiled again.
I'm glad that you and Mr. Malfoy have made peace with one another. You've both changed a great deal, and you're stronger for it. Now run along to the dungeons. Professor Snape informs me that Professor Calderau added the final ingredients to your exam potion. They're ready for your analysis. He'll meet you there. I was just thinking,
Harry said a few days later, when the almost conversation he and Draco had lately wouldn't leave him alone,
that maybe you could forget the part where I fucked things up last spring and we could try that other bit again. The part where we fucked instead of fucking up.
Draco was apparently startled into a bark of laughter by Harry's frankness. At least Harry hoped he was startled and not mocking him. He tried on a smile to prevent the awkwardness from setting in once Draco realized he hadn't been messing about. Draco looked over at him, eyes sparkling with humor, and maybe something else too. Harry tried to look closer, but it was gone before he could identify it.
Potter, you silly bugger. Why does everyone say that to me?
Harry wondered. He reconvened, stirring his potion, as this line of inquiry was evidently going nowhere. Nowhere he was interested in going anyway. Draco snorted.
You can't be serious.
But the way he said it, the tone of his voice suggested it was less statement than question.
Potter, we already...
I know, Harry said. Bugger. Shouldn't have let himself get so maudlin last night. 3/5 happy was loads more than lots of other people got. Now his mouth was running off without leave again.
Well, I'm not, seeing anyone, and neither are you, to the best of my knowledge.
I'm not, Draco supplied after an awkward moment. This cheered Harry more than was healthy, he reckoned.
Well, right then, so we're unattached, healthy, strapping young men. There are certain, needs.
He chanced a glance at Draco and found him regarding Harry with a carefully blank expression.
There are also hands, said Draco. Single, attractive people don't engage in affairs with one another just because they're of compatible sexual orientations and state of freedom.
There was that word again. Malfoy was beginning to sound very American.
Look,
said Harry, setting his stirring rod aside. Malfoy didn't look away from his Transfigurations text, but did appear to be listening.
I know I said I could stop feeling particularly about you, and I know we both know, and that, well, was a lie. Maybe not really a lie, but I didn't know at the time how to deal with having those sorts of feelings. It had never happened before, you know.
Draco didn't respond at all, but it seemed to Harry that his shoulders stiffened some. Which part provoked it, Harry couldn't say. It couldn't have been the last bit. Everyone knew Harry hadn't ever managed a successful relationship. Harry sighed.
But now I've had almost a year to get used to the feeling. Being away from you all summer helped. It made me realize that I could exist without you, even if I didn't particularly want to. Before, I thought that my life would be defined by whether or not you returned it. But I realized that life isn't either or. It can be an entire scale of possibilities. Maybe, yeah, it would put me at the top of the scale if you felt the same about me, but I figure I'm about 60% happy right now, with just us being friends, and that's not a bad start."
He stopped, swallowed heavily around the thick words he wanted to say, but wasn't sure were wise. He'd hate himself if they pushed Draco away. He'd hate himself if he never said them. Always wondered, what if?
"I desire you, still,"
Harry finally said.
"I've never wanted anyone before. I waited to see if it was just a crush, to see if it would fade. It hasn't. I want you as much as I ever did, and I won't delude myself this time into thinking that I'll be able to stop feeling. You were right. Not even I can do that, but this is what I can do."
And here he looked up and stared hard until Draco was forced to meet his gaze.
"I can feel enough for you to let you go, or let you stay, or let you both. Whatever you want, I want it too. You still want me too, I think. I think that's what you meant the other night when we talked about your father. But you didn't want to lead me on, so thanks for that. But I love you enough that I'm content to put all my Gryffindor romance notions aside if the only way you want me is a blow and an argument about Quidditch the next morning. Even knowing you'll end it. It would be better to have you for a while partially than not at all. And I think you need to have someone for a while too. I'll be your distraction." "Are you suggesting friends with benefits?" Draco asked. "I suppose so,"
Harry grimaced.
"I'm suggesting whatever you need, or want."
Draco's eyes narrowed.
"No strings. Not a threat,"
Harry assured him. Draco exhaled in a rush, and suddenly he looked furious.
"Harry?"
The word was so inflected, but Harry had no idea what the inflection meant. He was still too startled over hearing it from Draco again.
"You are asking me to take advantage of you. I'm telling you that you wouldn't be taking advantage of me. Oh, for fuck's sake,"
Draco muttered.
"I'm just saying,"
said Harry before Draco could get started.
If you ever wanted to, then go for it. I'll welcome it and I'll never try to cage you." "This is ridiculous,"
said Draco, but his voice was so quiet and his eyes were so wide that Harry rather thought Draco was thinking anything but.
"I quite agree."
They both jumped, turned to face the newly occupied Caravaggio. Snape looked annoyed and disappointed in the both of them.
"Potter, I didn't know what stupid scheme you've put together, but I'll thank you to not involve my godson in it. Given the end his father suffered, you well know how tenuous his hold on freedom is."
Harry pressed his lips into a flat line. That word. Repetition was starting to make it sound like gibberish to him.
"Yes, Professor. How unthinking of me."
Snape said. He eyed them both, now seeming to realize that perhaps he'd not got the entire gist of the conversation.
"Well, Potter, have you completed your analysis of the polyjuices?" "Yes, sir," said Harry. "Flask 1 is the human polyjuice."
Snape's mouth twitched on one side. It sort of looked pleased, as far as Harry could tell, but it could have also meant that Snape was smirking at him.
"And the types are fair in Flask 2 and 3?
He queried, of course not telling Harry whether he was right or not.
"Trick question,"
Harry said, narrowing his eyes at the portrait.
"Flask 2 was a crocodile scale, and Flask 3 was an augury feather."
Snape's smirk intensified. It was definitely a smirk. It was just that Snape's smirk could also mean he was really chuffed about something Harry did, which meant he was correct.
"You seem quite certain."
"Yes."
"Certain enough to drink the first flask?"
asked Snape, one eyebrow up. Harry briefly considered the horror it would be to accidentally polyjuice into a crocodile. But well, Gryffindor. In an answer, Harry uncupped Flask 1 and tipped it back. Immediately he felt himself changing. His skin tingled all over. His hair grew, his nose straightened, his teeth changed, his shoulders narrowed, and his waist too, and then— "Merlin!" Harry squeaked. His junk disappeared.
"Oh my God!"
Harry said, and his voice was definitely not his own.
everything changed, and I'm really sort of terrified right now. I've got breasts and pierced nipples. What the fuck? Where's my cock, for fuck's sake?
Draco started laughing. Harry turned to face Snape's portrait, horrified, and nearly fell flat on his face. His center of gravity was all wrong. How did Ginny even stay on a broom if women had to spend so much effort just staying upright? I have a... He couldn't say it.
Vagina,
Snape offered.
I am pleased.
Snape paused here, a look of consternation on his face. He frowned.
I am pleased that you chose to correct Flask.
He corrected. Then,
what are your thoughts on the transformation so far, Potter? But I need to take the antidote right now,
said Harry, already moving towards the door. He'd find Miguela, and she'd give him the antidote. Then he could have his bollocks back.
Snape said. Not quite yet, I think. This is part of the assignment. You will remain as you are for an entire hour, noting the difference in the body, and when you've transformed back, you will have Draco perform a gender transfiguration on you, so that you may compare the effects. You knew this, Potter.
I knew it, he muttered in Miguela's pretty voice. It's rather hard to concentrate on an assignment when you're panicking about your missing cock, though, Professor. God, he sort of had to pee, too. But like hell if he was going to actually go now. Draco snorted again.
Do mind your language, Potter,
Snape said.
I am not your Weasley. Now, the effects.
Harry took a deep breath. It was a smooth transformation. I feel fine. No tingling, no numbness, no dizziness.
You noticed that your balance has changed?
Snape observed. Yes, it's sort of lower. He tried to walk. I feel swaggery.
You look swaggery,
Draco said, choking on his laughter. Harry attempted to swing his hips like Hermione did, but ended up tripping and nearly smashing Miguela's face into the floor. Professor, really, this is quite enough. What am I going to do for an hour like this?
This is part of your apprenticeship, Potter. Withstanding the effects of potions one does not find entirely comfortable. It's imperative that a potions master is intimately familiar with every potion he brews.
So you turned into a woman when you were apprenticing too? Harry asked. Who'd you do? He thought it would rise Snape up a bit. He thought it might annoy him enough that he'd let Harry take the antidote. He should have known better.
Your mother,
said Snape. Harry's mouth dropped open. He closed it with a snap. Damn him. Fine, he said. He was not going to go there. Draco and I can work on our project while you sit over there in your linseed oil and try to dry.
You could,
Snape agreed unperturbed.
Or you could attempt to assure me I chose a worthy apprentice by making the connection between your inter-subject project and the assignments I've set you to this past month.
Harry blinked. His eyelashes were curlier than usual. Everything was so different. Did he have a uterus? What would sex be like? Could a man get pregnant and give birth if he was on polyjuice for 9 months? Harry put a horrified face at the thought. That was an experiment he would not be conducting. He'd stick to explosions. He said. He was still adjusting to all the changes and he... Oh! He turned abruptly, stared wide-eyed at his oil-painted master. Change! You've had me studying concepts of change.
Obviously,
said Snape, which made Draco start snickering again. Snape gave him a confused look, but was unwilling to ask why that so amused his godson. You think we've studied something that approaches the magnum opus, Harry said, and all sorts of little light bulbs were flickering on in his head. He turned to Draco, beaming, and it didn't take Draco long at all to make the connections. Polyjuice? But polyjuice doesn't work on gold. People have tried before. Hadn't you already been theorizing about this with Draco just last month?
What happens when they try it?
Asked Snape, no doubt already knowing the answer. He approached the front of the canvas and stared intently down at the two of them.
Furthermore, you have the ability to attempt a line of inquiry I've never had. What happens when an animagus takes polyjuice?
Harry's eyes widened. I don't know. Flung an extinguishing spell at his wacko burner, despite the fact that the harsh dousing would make it even more emotional the next time he used it, and a stasis at his potion. But I'm going to find out. Come on, Malfoy. I need you there in case I get stuck. Draco gasped, and when Harry met his eyes, his own face flushed. He hadn't even been thinking of that, but there was no denying that if Malfoy talked dirty to him, Harry would definitely remember what it was like to be human, and male, and randy.
Right, Draco said. Let's go.
After barely escaping what would no doubt be an awkward confrontation with the headmistress, Harry and Draco made it out to the grounds. Harry wasn't quite sure of his new gait, but he managed to make it down the steps and then the rocky, grassy slope that led to Hagrid's and the forest beyond. They curled around the edge of it for a few minutes, looking for a discreet place to enter. Draco seemed hesitant to go in, but Harry felt more alive in the Forbidden Forest than anywhere else. It was where he'd died, after all, and where he'd lived again. When they finally passed the Quidditch pitch and descended the hill beyond it, Harry slipped into the trees, knowing Draco would follow. There was no particular path, but he picked his way through with ease, having some instinctual understanding of the forest. Or maybe he just remembered somehow the path he'd taken during the final battle, for it wasn't long before the trees broke away and Harry was staring into a clearing. He inhaled sharply. 10 feet before him, he had died. Harry walked forward, feeling brush and leaves crunch beneath his shoes.
Harry?
Draco said, coming to stand beside him. Harry shook his head.
This is where it happened. I thought I didn't think I remembered how to get here. I was so out of it when I came that night. Out of my mind, I mean. I don't think I really knew what was happening. I'd buried it beneath something else.
Here? Asked Draco, and suddenly he seemed terrified, or as close to it as Malfoy's ever got.
Yeah, here.
Harry checked his watch. It hung from his tiny wrist. 20 minutes until the polyjuice wore off.
I'm going to transform now.
Draco nodded, said nothing. The detached look was on his face. Closing his eyes, Harry concentrated and forced himself to change. It was easier this time, quicker. His arms turned to wings, and he pumped them forcefully, taking off for the trees even as his feet were growing talons. Harry struggled for a few seconds until instinct kicked in and he began to understand the mechanics of flying. He pumped his wings again, and then he was soaring all through the trees, avoiding branches and other obstacles with ease. He settled onto a branch to rest, not quite accustomed to the maneuvering yet. He looked down towards the forest floor, and there they were. The little crawling spirits of long-dead creatures, too stupid to know they were dead. He could send them on their way in this state. He could look into the afterlife if he tried hard enough. But he didn't want to. Harry would leave that for the real crows. He turned and found Draco still standing in the middle of the clearing, looking back up at him with a bemused frown. Dead things were crawling all over his feet, curling about his legs. Little foxes wrapped their tails around his calves, and snakes slithered up his torso to settle on his arms. He had no idea he was being covered in moths and beetles, that thestrals were circling him, flickering ghostly tails. And Harry couldn't look away from the disturbing sight. Draco's life was attractive to the spirits, and to him. There was something undeniably alive about Draco, something that Harry hadn't realized he didn't feel until he looked at it.
I see you,
Harry thought.
I see all of you now.
It felt like every important moment in Harry's life had been connected to Draco in some way, and he couldn't think of anything but the smell of burning and the screams of fiend fire. That had been the moment Harry changed. He'd just not realized it until now. Every alchemy required a catalyst, and saving Draco Malfoy had been his. And suddenly, Harry knew. He knew what they were missing. He should have known from the start when Draco first suggested he read Paracelsus, because it had been right there. He flew down, transformed neatly back to himself.
"It's the Azoth,"
he said.
"the mercury."
Draco quirked an eyebrow, eyed him from top to bottom.
"You have no idea what a marvel you are, do you?"
"What?"
"There's 10 minutes left on your polyjuice, and yet you're you."
Harry looked down, startled. So he was. He'd overwritten a very precise potion, and he had no idea how. He shook his head. He could ask Snape about that later. Maybe he'd just misbrewed it.
"Draco, listen. The Azoth,"
Draco said, bored.
"What about it?"
"It's what we're missing," Harry said. "The spirit of change.
I was right about the Felix Felicis hypothesis. I know it. We have to make the opposite of the Philosopher's Stone. It's the Azoth that turns it into the magnum opus."
Draco stilled.
"A stone for poverty, death, and illness?"
He shook his head.
"Harry, you can't be serious. We can't make that."
He paused, considered.
"No, we definitely could make it, but it's insane."
"If it was easy, don't you think every second-degree alchemist in the world would have made one by now?" Harry said.
"I know this is right."
Draco grimaced.
"This is mad,"
he whispered, seemingly to himself. When he looked back at Harry some minutes later, his face was bloodless, shocked.
"I think you're right, Harry."
Harry's face was pained. This was so much farther than a silly intersubject project. It was so much more. He flicked his eyes back to Draco's.
"We could abandon it, do something different," he suggested.
Draco exhaled in a rush, walked away, then came back as if he had no idea what to do with himself.
"No, we can't, Harry."
Harry nodded. He knew.
"We can't tell anyone."
Draco smiled ruefully.
"I know."
As one, they turned and began picking their way back through the forbidden forest to the grounds. Harry's heart was hammering, and for the first time it wasn't due to Draco's presence. Everything was still and silent all around him, but a flash of blue caught his eyes as he stepped over a fallen tree trunk, and he gasped.
"What is it?"
Draco whispered, as if the silence of the forest was affecting him too. Harry shook his head. He could still see them. The little creature's spirits were following along behind him, trailing after Draco and all the life he gave off. There was still a ghostly rune spore cozied up around his neck, and he had no idea the effect he had on dead things, or on Harry, who was arguably a dead thing himself.
"Nothing."
The creatures followed them all the way to the edge of the forest, where they stopped and stared after Draco from the safety of the trees. Draco hesitated a few feet beyond the forest, his brow scrunching up in something like confusion.
"What is it?"
Harry echoed.
Draco
turned, looking all around.
I felt something unusual."
Harry bit his lip, eyed the little blue ghosts.
"Like what?"
Draco shook his head and turned back to the trees, trailing his hand along the foliage as he walked, as if feeling for something. The spirits were following his hand, trying to get close enough to nuzzle his fingers.
"I don't know."
Harry followed him as he walked and said nothing. Draco stopped near to Hagrid's hut, where the rocky highland slope sunk into the forbidden forest, and looked around again.
"It's here,"
he said.
"What is?"
Draco shrugged, a highly irregular gesture.
"Something's resonating. Don't you hear it? Or feel it? I'm not sure."
At that moment, one of the spirit beetles crawled over a stone, trying to scuttle closer to Draco's outreached hand. Draco made a sudden noise in the back of his throat and bent. The rock beetle and all hopped into his hand. He stood staring in consternation at it.
"It's nice,"
he said, flickering his eyes up to Harry.
Same thing my stone cauldron's made from. The one you brew salamoniac potions in? Yeah,
Draco said distractedly. He turned the rough pink stone over in his hand, but the frown on his face didn't ease.
It's a metamorphic stone, made from quartz and other things. My father used it as a focus stone inlay in his wand. Why? Quartz resonates with a particular frequency. A frequency that aligns with that of magic. The other minerals in it help to concentrate it.
Harry's eyebrows lifted. He glanced around the grounds. The same rock was pushing up from the ground all over. Some of the stones of the castle were the same greyish-pink of that in Draco's hand. If that was the case, then no wonder Hogwarts had such a big personality. It was practically swimming in this stuff. But that still left one question.
Why did you sense that now, especially if it's so common? I haven't the slightest idea, said Draco. McGonagall had me working on mineral transmutations recently. Maybe I'm just more tuned to particular compositions of them now.
Harry scrunched his nose, remembering the beetle. Carefully, he said.
But you wanted that particular stone? It feels different from all the rest. It feels more. More,
Harry repeated dubiously.
Like, yeah, it's more alive.
The beetle was still crawling happily around Draco's wrist. Harry watched it for a moment, feeling something like rat curl up in his gut. What had the spirit beetle done to the stone to attract Draco to it? And what would it do to Draco? Harry strode to him, grabbed his wrist under pretense of having a look at the gneiss. He squashed the beetle, sending it off to wherever dead beetles were meant to go, and felt not a second's regret. There was absolutely no way he was going to let one of those spirits drink up Draco's life force or whatever they wanted to do. Draco inhaled sharply at Harry's touch, and their eyes met, both startled. Draco's pulse was hammering beneath Harry's finger, his skin heating. At once, Harry remembered Draco's fantasy, his throaty voice as he recited it, and his breath thick and heavy. Draco's eyes were mercurial in the fading light. Harry squeezed his wrists tighter and barely recognized what he was doing. Stepped closer. Draco didn't step back. Their mouths were inches apart. He could feel Draco's breath puffing against his lips, and it sent shivers down his back. What was he doing? He'd promised.
We should go back,
said Harry, forcing himself to take a step backwards.
You've still got to do that human transfiguration on me, and I'd rather be in my rooms for that.
Draco licked his bottom lip, nodded once.
Of course.
He turned and started up the slope to the castle, slipping the stone in his pocket as he went. Harry took a moment to compose himself, but he soon realized it would take much longer than a moment.
Fuck!
He breathed. He ran to catch up, with one last glare at the spirits, daring one of them to follow. Draco was already holding the portrait to Harry's room open by the time Harry got there, and damn it, one day he was going to figure out how that git kept getting in. He changed his password twice already. Their shoulders brushed as Harry stepped through, and he suppressed a shiver as best as he could. It was like Draco's skin was made of the same quartz, piezoelectric and attuned specifically to Harry. The Botticelli shot behind them, and Harry headed for his seatee, but a hand on his shoulder jerked him to a stop. Draco spun him around and pressed him against the door. All the breath rushed from Harry's lungs.
Potter, you can't keep doing this to me.
And then he kissed him. It was sudden and hot and everything Harry remembered, only 1,000 times better since it was happening right then.
Doing what?
Harry managed around a gasp. He squeezed his eyes shut, certain he would die if he opened them and this wasn't real.
"Making me want you,"
Draco sat into his skin as he trailed a slick trail of kisses down his neck.
"I can barely function as it is, and then you go around counteracting potages because you feel like it, and swanning through trees and staring at me like you could live off the carbon dioxide I exhale."
Harry was startled into a laugh, but Draco's fingers tugged at the button of his apprentice robes, and he stopped at once.
"Shut up,"
Draco said, as if Harry might still be considering speaking, which he wasn't.
"I read your stupid muggle chemistry book."
Harry felt warm all over, and it wasn't entirely due to arousal. It was just that the book reminded him of Draco's irregular method of shocking Hermione out of her animagus form. His arms came up and pulled Draco tightly to him, effectively stopping his progress with Harry's robes. He kissed him fiercely once, then pushed him back a bit to take his hand. Harry tucked him towards the bedroom, and the wall sconces flickered on as he entered, and the light flowed across the walls with the reflection of the lake coming through the window. Severia, sleeping on the bed, was quickly dispatched as Harry levitated her through the door and set her carefully down on the armchair. She didn't even wake. He shut the door behind her and turned to Draco, smirking. Wanda's magic was as easy as breathing when Draco was around. Draco growled and tugged at Harry's buttons again until he had the entire row of them undone. Harry's robes fell off his shoulders and pulled at their feet. The sun brush of dungeon air against his fevered skin made him shudder, but Draco followed it with his hands, running them down Harry's arms and over the thin t-shirt he wore beneath. Harry arched against Draco's finger trailing down his chest, his eyes falling shut, and when he opened them again, he found Draco staring back at him with more intensity than he'd ever seen. At once, everything slowed. The desperate need was still there, but like dreamless sleep potion, it was simmering slowly beneath the surface. Draco tugged at his shirt hem, and Harry obediently lifted his arms. Everything was silent then. Nothing but the rustle of clothes as it hit the floor. This was that Event Horizon thing, Harry thought. He tried to gorge Draco's thoughts, but he'd long ago set his wall sconces to never rise above a certain luminescence, and it was too dark now to see clearly. Carefully he reached out, ran his hand up Draco's arm, and curved it around his neck to draw him closer. This time when they kissed, it was softer, more measured, but still organic. Harry whimpered against Draco's mouth, feeling himself falling apart and unable or unwilling to stop the destruction. He slowly threaded his fingers through Draco's hair. Merlin, it was just as soft as he'd imagined it. He heard their breathing filling the room and felt the air becoming humid. They pulled apart to strip Draco's robes off, and Harry fell back on the bed at the merest push. Draco crawled up after him, and Harry was mesmerized by the curve his back made as he bent down to slide their mouths together again. Harry reached down and drew his fingers around the edge of Draco's waistband, hesitant, asking permission. He felt Draco's abdomen contract at the contact, and it flooded him with desire. His touch was doing that.
"Yes,"
Draco answered against his mouth. He drew one hand down and placed it over Harry's. Their fingers interlocked, and Draco slid their joined hands over till Harry's palm was fitted over the hot, thick bulge in Draco's trousers. Harry shuddered. His fingers curled around it, unable to help himself. Draco moaned and arched into the touch, his mouth pulling away from Harry's to gasp for more breath. It was all too much for Harry. He flipped them over, reversing their positions, and popped the row of buttons out and set his hand all the way up Draco's thigh, curled over the waistband of his trousers, and pulled them down. Draco's cock bobbed free, a rush of cool dungeon air against his skin, making him shudder. He spent a long moment taking in the sight before him, of Draco sprawled on his bed, skin flushed, panting. He had nice Quidditch-toned thighs. He had nice feet with long toes currently curled up in anticipation. His shoulders were wide, and the rest of him lanky and glaringly patrician. And he had a nice penis, too, Harry thought, somewhat hysterically. It was leaking all over his stomach right now, and Harry desperately wanted to know what it tasted like. Draco pulled himself up on his elbows and somehow managed to look in control of the situation, despite the utter disarray of his hair and body.
"Why aren't you naked?"
Harry really had no idea, but the words were doing terrible things to him. Or maybe that was just the weighty look in Draco's eyes. He sat off the bed and fumbled with the buttons of his trousers until he managed to get them undone. Draco was still propped up, watching, apparently unconcerned about having his cock out. Hands shaking, Harry lowered his trousers, stepped out of them, and kicked them off to the side. Draco's eyes immediately fell to the area in question. The moment lasted 30 years in Harry's estimation. He'd never had his cock out in front of anyone before, save for the Quidditch changing rooms, and he would have expected to feel horribly exposed and vulnerable, with some fit bloke staring right at it. He did. He just hadn't expected to become even more aroused by the exposure. He growled lightly, pushed at Draco's shoulder until he lay back on the bed. He could not bear to not know what Draco's skin felt like against his any longer. His chest tightened, frantic, aching feeling as their lips met. He clenched his eyes shut tight and put everything he had into that kiss, knowing that he wasn't honoring the offer he'd made Draco, but unable to stop himself. Draco made him a liar. Draco made him more honest than he'd ever been in his life. He pulled back from the kiss with a gasp, and Draco's eyes flew open, wide and startled.
"Fuck, I love you,"
Harry thought resignedly. Draco moaned, and it was hot. And then everything rushed at Harry, a surge of almost unbearable pleasure, and he lost it, coming all over their hands and their stomachs. Draco arched upwards at the first splash of cum against his chest, and Harry twisted his hand the way he liked himself, and then Draco was coming, and it was the most amazing thing Harry had ever seen in his life. Harry dropped his head, panting. His elbows began to tremble, and he knew he had to roll away, or else he'd collapse on top of Draco. He opened his eyes to look at him again, to have his one moment where they'd done this to each other, and their bodies were still tangled together, as they ought to be, and was surprised to find Draco looking back at him. He looked startled. He looked devastated. Like maybe he just realized something he'd never known. Harry rolled away. He'd probably just now realized what they'd done, and then he'd run, and they'd never talk of it again, despite how Harry's life would never be the same again. Harry stared at the plaster ceiling, listening to Draco's breathing returning to normal. His own was starting to rush again, with the terror inherent in the possibility that he'd fucked up spectacularly by letting this happen. No matter what he'd said to Draco in a moment of weakness, he didn't think he'd be able to do this. He was, truly, his own worst enemy. Draco cleared his throat. Harry forced a grin as he rolled over to face him. "Damage control time."
"Well?"
he asked with vast nonchalance. Draco cleared his throat again.
"Average? Like hell it was,"
Harry thought. He rolled his eyes.
"Could have done worse, I suppose. At least I'm as good at getting blokes off my first time as I am at transfigurations after 7 years of it."
Draco looked surprised at the confession, but thankfully didn't comment on it. Harry ran his fingers through the cum on his belly, feeling amazed that it was there at all. There like that for a long time, and it was pretty much the best day of Harry's life ever. And also the worst. He knew it was stupid for thinking this, but he really hoped Draco didn't want to end this too soon. Maybe Harry was just a glutton for punishment. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Azoth by Zeitgeistic. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.